The secrets of the woman Frank Lagasse found on the gravel shore of Lake Erie on the 5th of September 1934, the first victim in a series of terrible murders, are lost to time, as are the stories of the men and women who shared her dark fate. Was she a sister, an auntie, or even someone's long-lost friend? Was her hair lush and auburn, or did she pin back her flaxen locks? Did she smile at the sight of children playing stickball in the streets? It's impossible to say, because when Lagasse found the Lady of the Lake, she was missing her head, her arms, and most of her legs. She was also 6 months dead, though her body had apparently been coated in some kind of preservative that left her skin red, leathery, and impervious to Erie's dark waters. Police were at a loss, and little did they know that her appearance was a sign of more gruesome discoveries to come. The Great Depression had laid waste to Cleveland, transforming a once prosperous hub of industry into a scene of chaos and corruption. Desperate people were living in shanty towns, and in the most notorious slum, Kingsbury Run, folks built their own makeshift housing in empty lots, giving themselves over to vices because there was so little to live for. Though Prohibition had ended in 1933, just before Christmas, the high liquor taxes left bootleggers in control of the local markets, and it seemed that any money to be made was in crime. Those who were looking for action came to the Roaring Third, where the mob had moved in and prostitution, drugs, and gambling were the order of the day. Cleveland developed a reputation for lawlessness as its police force took bribes and turned a blind eye to malfeasance. A year after the Lady of the Lake washed up on shore, two teenage boys found more trouble than they bargained for when they decided to skip school on September 23, 1935. They headed over to Jackass Hill, off a dead-end street by Kingsbury Run. As they were nosing around, they discovered a headless, castrated body in a ditch, wearing socks and nothing else. When police came to the scene, they uncovered the man's buried head and estimated that the man had been dead for 2 or 3 days. The killer had drained the body of blood, and though it was relatively clean, there were rope burns around both of its wrists. The victim's fingerprints identified him as 28-year-old Edward Andrassy, who once worked as an orderly in the psychiatric ward at Cleveland City Hospital. He had since led a less than respectable life in Kingsbury Run, hanging out in the Roaring Third and dealing in porn, prostitution, and drugs. The police had caught him carrying concealed weapons and generally thought of him as a troublemaker. When Andrassy disappeared, he was living with his parents, on the run from the mob and fearing for his life, leading police to suspect that his death was the result of a hit job meant to scare others involved in the scene. But this theory didn't explain the second body they found when they searched the area. This victim was in his 40s, also headless and castrated. He seemed to have been dead for weeks, and his body was apparently covered with the same chemical preservative as the Lady of the Lake. The man was never identified. In both cases, the coroner, A.J. Pierce, determined that the men had died from decapitation, hemorrhage, and shock. He further noted that their limbs had been removed at the joints by a skilled cutter. Still, no one connected the murders with the death of the Lady in the Lake. And after a few months, the case went cold as police turned their attention towards new developments. In the fall of 1935, Harold Burton, Cleveland's new mayor, decided to get tough on crime and hired Eliot Ness to clean up the city's police and fire departments in his new role as public safety director. The 31-year-old lawman had become famous in the late 1920s for busting Al Capone's illegal alcohol operations in Chicago. The public saw Ness and his team, nicknamed the Untouchables, as beacons of integrity. Ness had a knack for sniffing out corruption and dealing with the press, and he was well known to be fearless in the face of the mob. Unfortunately, these talents would prove to be ill-suited to tracking down and apprehending an insane and perverted serial killer, driven by nothing more than bloodlust. When Ness accepted the job in Cleveland, he expected to spend his time taking on the mob and cleaning up corruption, not chasing an insane killer who would eventually ruin his career. In January 1936, a woman found 2 woven baskets filled with wrapped meat behind a butcher's dumpster. To her horror, what she first assumed to be hams neatly wrapped in newspaper were in fact human arms and legs in one basket and a headless female torso in the other. the Cleveland police used fingerprints to identify victim number 3 as Florence Polillo, a 42-year-old waitress and barmaid, housewife, and occasional prostitute, who at the time of her death lived right alongside the Roaring Third. Police again wondered if this was a mob hit, but when the press noted the similarities between Flo's murder and the Lady of the Lake, they began to change their tune. The coroner began to suspect the murders were less than random, though some were grateful that the butcher was targeting the city's less upstanding residents. As the body count rose, they became unsettled. In June 1936, 2 boys hiking through Kingsbury Run found a pair of discarded brown pants balled up on the ground near the East 55th Street Bridge. When they searched the pants for money, they were instead flashed with the sight of a man's head. The next day, railroad inspectors found the matching body dumped right in front of their office at the Nickel Plate Railroad, another death by decapitation. Though the man had clear fingerprints and 6 distinctive tattoos, police couldn't ID him. They even went as far as to make a plaster death mask of the man's head, which they displayed with drawings of his tattoos at the Great Lakes Exposition that year, in hopes that the public would solve the mystery, but they never did. Hundreds of thousands of viewers saw the tattooed man, but his name was lost. It wasn't long before another victim was found. That July, a 17-year-old girl spotted a brownish, rotting mass as she walked through the woods by Big Creek near the railroad tracks on the west side of Cleveland. This victim, another 40-something man, had been dead for at least 2 months. His head and darkly stained clothes were found nearby on the ground, soaked with blood. Victim number 5 also remained nameless. With bodies piling up and public attention on the rise, Ness brought Peter Merlo and Martin Zaleski on to investigate the case full-time. Personally, Ness kept his own attention on what he did best, cleaning up corruption, until another murder forced him to make a change. One day in September 1936, a transient who was trying to hop a train near Kingsbury Run accidentally stepped on a headless man's torso. When police searched a nearby pond, they found the castrated lower half of the torso with parts of its legs cut off. The press estimated that 600 townspeople watched as a diver recovered the remains of the man, who was in his late 20s. Coroner Pierce noted that the corpse had been dismembered without hesitation by someone who was knowledgeable enough about human anatomy to sever the head and limbs with clean strokes. The identity of victim number 6 was never discovered. The public spectacle sparked a media melee as the Cleveland News, the Cleveland Press, and the Cleveland Plain Dealer began making near-daily reports on the killings, railed at the police for their failure to name a suspect, nicknamed the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run. The coroner told the press that the killer was a strong, intelligent, and sadistic sex maniac, and possibly a medical student. As the mayor pressured Ness to prioritize the case, the safety director declared, quote, "I want to see this psycho get caught," end quote. Unfortunately, his talents were no match for this flavor of unhinged mayhem, and the tactics he used to bust organized crime rings did little to move the case forward. Though detectives Peter Merlo and Martin Zaleski questioned over 1,000 people and others in the department interviewed over 4,000 more, the investigation went nowhere. The killings continued. During the last week of February 1937, a young woman's upper and lower torso washed up on the beach at Beulah Park, in almost exactly the same location as the Lady of the Lake had been found years before. Her identity was never discovered. Later that June, a 14-year-old boy found a skull and the bony remains of a 40-something woman by a bridge near Cleveland. The coroner was able to use her dental work to identify her as Rose Wallace, known as a part-time prostitute in the Roaring Third. In July, police pulled a man's torso from the Cuyahoga River. All of its internal organs, except for its lungs, were missing. The police never identified the victims. The man's body had been spotted by a National Guardsman who was standing watch by a nearby bridge. The victim, who was in his mid to late 30s, was never identified. Less than a year had passed since Ness had personally taken up the case, and his team had no new leads. The public was losing patience. Months passed, but finally, things took a turn in the spring of the following year. In March 1938, a man from Sandusky, a town near Cleveland, was shocked to see his dog running toward him, clutching a man's leg in its jaws. David Cowles, the head of Cleveland's Scientific Identification Bureau, went to Sandusky to investigate. At the time, Cowles had been hearing tales about a doctor named Francis Sweeney, who habitually checked himself into the Ohio Soldiers and Sailors Home, a rehab center in Sandusky. Apparently, Sweeney, a World War I vet, had shell shock and nerve damage that he treated by drinking. Although he was an entirely competent surgeon, he was mentally unstable, and his wife had twice committed him to a psychiatric institution before divorcing him in 1934. She noted that during a bender, Sweeney would neglect his practice and go missing for days. Unfortunately for law enforcement, Sweeney's cousin, Martin Sweeney, was a well-connected Ohio congressman who was already critical of Ness's investigation of the so-called torso murders. Ness had to tread carefully. He had his detectives put Sweeney under surveillance, but they never caught him in any illegal activity. That April, the dismembered body of another woman appeared on the Cuyahoga riverbank, packed in 2 burlap bags. The coroner detected drugs in her system, which may have been used to immobilize her before death. Her identity was never confirmed. Ness became bolder, yet wily enough to keep his next move secret from the press. Concerned about Sweeney's family connections, he had his detectives kidnap the doctor and put him up in a suite at the Cleveland Hotel, where they held and interrogated him for 2 weeks without an attorney. But Sweeney never broke, and he mocked his captors, even after Ness called in an expert in criminology, Leonard Keeler, to administer a polygraph test, which Sweeney apparently failed. Keeler reportedly said, quote, "That's your man, might as well throw my machine at the window if I say anything different," end quote. But detectives still had a problem. Sweeney had nothing to legally incriminate himself. Without evidence, Ness couldn't risk a public scandal, given that Sweeney was so well connected. Out of options, the investigators grudgingly let Sweeney go. Meanwhile, the press ran a blind item that a mysterious Dr. X, a discredited physician with a history of mental problems, was a prime suspect in the case, but nothing came of their reports. After Sweeney's interrogation, things would come to a head. In mid-August, some men found a woman's torso wrapped in a man's double-breasted blue blazer and covered again by an old quilt as they were hunting for scraps in a dump. Her arms and legs had been wrapped in brown butcher paper and placed in a clumsily assembled box, held in place with rubber bands. The woman's head had also been wrapped in butcher paper. When the police came to investigate, they discovered another set of remains close by, in plain sight of Eliot Ness's office window. Neither victim could be identified. At his wit's end, Ness became reckless. On August 18th, a few dozen policemen and firefighters in squad cars, vans, and trucks raided Kingsbury Run, evicting hundreds of people and arresting scores more before searching for clues, coming up empty-handed and burning the slum to the ground. Ness believed he had stopped the murders, but his win was a Pyrrhic victory. The public thought Ness was heartless, and the press piled on, noting that the killer was still at large. Nonetheless, the murder stopped. Perhaps it was no coincidence that Francis Sweeney had checked into a mental hospital, where he stayed for several years. It may be that in a last-ditch effort to save his reputation, Ness sought to resolve the case once and for all. In July 1939, a Cuyahoga County sheriff named Martin O'Donnell arrested a 52-year-old bricklayer named Frank Dolezal for the murder of his former housemate and possible paramour, Flo Polillo. Dolezal also seemed to have known Rose Wallace and Edward Andrassy, but his account of the killing was unreliable. Many suspected that the police had coerced him into making a confession, and worse, that they beat him to death before his trial. On August 24, 1939, the 5'8" Dolezal was found hanging dead in his jail cell, suspended from a hook only 5'7" off the ground. An autopsy revealed that Dolezal had broken 6 ribs while he was held in custody. There was never any evidence that Dolezal had the knowledge or the capacity to carry out 12 or more murders with such grisly and surgical precision. today, few believe in his guilt. Eventually, Cleveland moved on, and the case of the Mad Butcher was mostly forgotten. However, Eliot Ness began receiving postcards signed F.E. Sweeney, Paranoidal Nemesis, in the 1950s, taunting him for his failures. No one can say whether these cards were authentic messages, but they were most certainly unwelcome to Ness, who had sunk into decline. During his tenure in Cleveland, Ness had personal troubles that worsened his problems. He had become a womanizer and a heavy drinker, who burned his professional bridges with a drunk driving arrest. Eventually, he left town in disgrace and died of a heart attack in 1957. It seems likely that the man the Cleveland press fingered as the Mad Killer, Dr. X, was Francis Sweeney after all. Sweeney had the anatomic knowledge and the tools, chemicals, and facilities he would need to commit the gruesome murders. Though he had passed 2 court-ordered psychiatric evaluations in 1938, in 1956 he was diagnosed as a schizophrenic. Ness had claimed that Sweeney's stint in a sanatorium helped him avoid prosecution, but Sweeney was never formally charged with the torso killings, and he died with a clean record in 1964. Through the years, only 3 of the Mad Butcher's victims were ever identified: Edward Andrassy, Florence Polillo, and Rose Wallace. The identities of the other unfortunate souls have been lost to time. In the eyes of the courts, the Mad Butcher of Kingsbury Run, also known as the Torso Murderer, will remain forever unresolved.